This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. Sumatra is the sixth largest island in the world, with just over twice the land area of Great Britain. During the summer of 2016, undergraduate biology students Oli Broadhead and Berger set out to walk across Sumatra to compare the biodiversity of untouched forests versus deforested ecosystems. They found their way into an unexplored forest that surrounds the 3,080-meter Mount Kuri, on which they attempted a first ascent. After leaving the forest, they had recorded over 60 species, then spent the next 3 weeks walking through rural Sumatra to the coast. Oli previously appeared in episode 114 at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ114. And you can learn more about Oli's adventures at his website, olibroadhead.com. Oli Broadhead, Berger, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What was your motivation for doing this adventure?
I guess for me it was kind of an opportunity to combine my scientific interests with my love for just going on an adventure. So we've both previously done expeditions before, but in this case we're actually recording biodiversity data and kind of doing research where no one's done research before.
What should we know and what do we need to know about the island of Sumatra?
The area of Sumatra we were in is a region called Aceh. Well, it's basically just come out of a pretty brutal civil war with the previous Indonesian government for independence, which really only ended in 2004 after the tsunami, and they had to accept international relief. And that's for a variety of reasons. Aceh is almost a fundamental Muslim province and actually has Sharia law, so it sees itself as separate from the rest of Sumatra and is historically separate. But as a result of this civil war, a lot of Aceh, certainly central Aceh, is fairly unexplored and has a very low population density compared to areas a bit further down, towards the bigger cities, towards Medan. So for that reason, we were thinking there, if you're going to look for rainforests where no one's previously been, where no one's previously conducted scientific research, then that province, Aceh province, because of this historical violence, is been not really visited before and not much exploration in that area.
How much planning did you have to put into this in terms of logistics and so on before you went over there?
So we tried to do a lot, but ended up not doing as much as we wanted to do, basically because we didn't know where we could go, which ended up being a different place, and actually finding someone who could direct us to local researchers or guides was really quite difficult. So we ended up doing most of the stuff just out there, buying most of the food and even equipment, getting with the permits and so on. We actually just did on ground with 5 days before we actually started. Okay.
Oli, the last time we spoke about your previous adventure, you guys were on a pretty small budget. Was that a similar thing this time?
This time, no, we upped it this time. We were very, very lucky to get research sponsorship from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland because we had this scientific purpose to the expedition, and that largely funded it. But we did have obviously a much bigger budget because we had to, rather than sort of what I was doing last time, just buying rice in sort of tiny villages, we were carrying quite a lot of food with us because we're in very remote areas. We had a bigger team. Last time it was 2 person, this time it was 4 people. And there were a lot more issues getting into areas, transport and all that, and it did come to significantly more. But despite that, between 4 of us, the expedition came to £950. So, we were there, we were in the forest for over 2 weeks. So it's not too bad, really. And we got most of that funded by the University of Edinburgh. And then when we came out and we were walking to the coast, again, we pretty much cut it down to pretty much living for free, really. Maybe talk a bit about that later. But again, it wasn't by any means a big budget. Certainly, I was surprised that we did manage to get into fairly serious jungle, which you'd usually think of being some sort of big, heavily sponsored team effort. And actually, between us, we managed to keep it pretty cheap. But again, you do have to carry equipment, and you do need some slightly more specialist planning and a bit more thought goes into it than just sort of walking across a continent. So it didn't quite make the same cost as we did last time, which is a bit mad.
Tell me about the other two members of the team.
So that's Roy and Said both have an awful lot of jungle experience, and because the aim is actually to make 100 first ascents in Sumatra, and I think they're on, 20 at the moment, so they're actually doing pretty well. Both of them do not do any organised trips for tourists as such. We only actually found out about them through another friend, a photographer, who had contacts who knew them and knew that they had a lot of experience and are well qualified to actually be and go through the forest with like GPS and working out and cutting through unexplored forest.
Yeah, they'd actually, both of them are from Aceh, and both have previously worked. Roy, after the Southern Force Tsunami, had worked with international relief organisations for about almost a decade, so he spoke very good English. And Saeed is an absolute legend of a mountain climber and a very good navigator, but again, both from that area. And interestingly enough, they both initially were going to turn us down because they're not guides, they're not professional guides. And I don't think they were particularly interested in that. And then when we were talking about the scientific interest and that we were going to be doing research in this area, they got a lot more interested because they were very interested in these areas they'd previously explored, in bringing scientists into these areas because, they feel very strongly, that's their home, and they're very keen to get protection for these forests and for these mountains. And there's been very little scientific interest in these areas before. So they were very excited to work with us on this expedition, I think.
Iris, I'm curious about what other expeditions or adventures you might have been on before this one.
So the summer before, I cycled across Bolivia, which was a great experience, but didn't have that sort of scientific point to it, really. So it was actually great going this mega Transect across Sumatra. And I guess being an undergrad biology student, I did as well the summer before. I went to the Amazon rainforest and worked as a scientific research assistant there.
What does that word mean, mega transect?
So we're not actually sure if that's a proper word or not.
Definitely not a proper word. The idea of the mega transect that this guy did in the 80s was that he walked for 2 years through the forests of West and Central Africa. And it's just, if no one's done research there before, just a massive trek recording absolutely everything you see effectively as just the best way to get a very quick, very simple, but really very effective idea of just what's in these forests. Because you don't know, no one's done research before. So it's not like you're following on or building on previous research. You just got to go in there and just see. And just as long as you're recording it and doing some sort of attempt at working out what biodiversity might be and what the number of species and the abundance of species is, then that was kind of the idea of the mega transect. Just it's rather than being over 100 meters or a kilometer, it was over, over sort of in the forest over 40 something kilometers, and then after that over about 400 or 500. That's the idea. You do this one-off big cut through, record everything as you go.
What do you guys do when you're out there as biologists? I mean, what's kind of in your toolkit? Do you just have a pencil and a paper, or do you have a GPS, and are you logging GPS results as you go? And so explain that to me.
So actually, I just had two quite small notebooks, waterproof notebooks, because you need that, and a pencil. We did have a GPS, but that was actually Saeed had one. We tried to record every animal we saw. It was mainly birds, just because you see a lot of birds. If we saw birds, then we'd record what species. Well, we had a guidebook, identification book for birds. So we recorded species, GPS coordinates, elevation, habitat type, the time, the weather, and any additional notes that could be anyway useful. And then if you're walking, if you see another species, do the same thing. But if it's the same species again, we would not record it until we get a list of 20 species. And then after 20 species, you start from scratch. So everything you recorded before, you record again. Because in this way, it gives you kind of an idea of the species diversity and abundance, because you literally just can't record every single organism, every single bird. It's just impossible.
The idea with the 2020 list is that if a species, obviously you're recording every single species you see, But if that species is on multiple lists, then it's abundant. And the more species you get, then obviously higher biodiversity. So it's a way of recording both biodiversity and species abundance, and abundance of individual species within that area. So it's a very simple way of working out abundance from just biodiversity.
Do you use binoculars?
Yeah, we have binoculars, which are really useful.
You were hoping to go over there and get in Loiser National Park, but you were not able to. Tell me about that kind of situation and why you wanted to go there and why you were not able to get in.
When we started looking at this expedition, and we kind of, through a variety of reasons, came upon Sumatra, I emailed quite a lot of researchers, and a guy called Professor Sergey Wicks, who works with orangutans there, emailed me and said, you've got to get into this Loiser, because Loiser is the biggest national park in Southeast Asia, and in theory is the most biodiverse ecosystem outside of the Amazon. So it's an absolutely fantastic place. And he was like, you've got to get there, and I'll give the coordinates to this valley that no one's done research in. It's 40-kilometer, very remote valley that it would be absolutely fascinating to go in. So I was like, okay, brilliant. And I started emailing a lot of people trying to get permits. And I think, as Iris has already said, we just got refused at every turn and decided to fly out to Sumatra anyway. And we got to Sumatra, and it basically came down to the reserve would not let us walk in that area unless we took government official, park guide, 2 porters, I think, with us, paying those guys daily wages. Those guys, 2 of them at least, wouldn't be expedition trained or have any interest in being there. And they were, at a pretty extortionate cost. And they were basically telling us to, they didn't want us there, effectively. And we were talking to Roy and Said about why this might have been, why we couldn't get into Loiser. And we basically came to the conclusion that during the Aceh conflict, and also during the last sort of over 30 years of the previous government being a very, very corrupt Javanese government, and plus the civil war, that the majority of the national park is just really gone. It's been horrifically exploited outside of a few isolated pockets where there are a couple of research stations and some tourist lodges, but outside of those very limited areas, even though the government still wants to give this illusion that it's an incredibly diverse ecosystem and that it's unspoiled forest, that it's almost certainly not, and it's probably been heavily logged. And we think during the conflict, there was also a lot of gun and drug running in those areas, and they just don't want researchers going in outside of the sort of the official research stations. They don't want expeditions going through into those remote areas. And the other thing we talked about here was that it was so strange that we were the first scientists into this area, just a few 100 kilometers north of Loiser. And Loiser almost acts as this sink where it's one of the only places you can actually get permission to do research is within this national park, which is really the only protected forest in that area of Sumatra. And that just draws attention and draws funding and draws protection away from these fantastic surrounding forests that we were going into, because all this scientific research is being conducted from 1 or 2 research stations within Loiser where you can get government permits. But outside of that, they're just not giving you permits. And there's no data coming out of those areas, and there's no protection as a result of that being given to those areas. So it's this national park, I guess, is sort of a bit of a curse for the surrounding forest, at least. And hopefully, I'm sure some of it is still pristine, but from what we think, this valley at least was not as pristine as the government would like you to believe in terms of whether there was deforestation occurring in that area.
So having said all that, wouldn't it have been some concern to you to maybe go into an area that could have all these issues with poachers and loggers and drug smugglers and so on?
I think the drug and arms smuggling since the end of the Civil War has decreased. I think Iris was going to say we did see poachers on the first day leaving the village. We did meet poachers. I guess over to Iris on that one. That was something you were particularly interested in.
I guess we didn't feel threatened at that point. They seemed just to be, right orders. There's local guys from probably the next village. They had about 20 birds of exotic bulbuls, which are amazing, brightly coloured exotic birds. And they had quite big guns in them. According to Roy, they're actually just hunting them for food. Because there's not that much out there. There's farming of rice, but again, those are really poor areas. So we didn't feel threatened at that point, but we could see there's poaching going on. And actually, by doing research in this area, which is quite close, just north of Loiser, actually, we're hoping to show that there's an incredible biodiversity out there as well, so that maybe it could push the boundaries and make sure that area just doesn't lost, and illegal logging and poaching should be more prevented. And
I think because as well is that the area we're in, one of the reasons it's unspoiled and hasn't been logged is because it's very mountainous. Loisa's low altitude rainforest, so it's very biodiverse, quite easily accessible. A lot of villages in that area, it's area that if you cut down, you could farm almost. Whereas where we're in, it's higher mountain, all over 1,000 meters. It's cold. It's quite a very different environment, a lot of moss forest. So in terms of logging prospects, it's much less, I think, attractive. And the villages there are very poor, but also sort of tucked away in these little valleys. So they're not really, I think, in the same, there's not going to be sort of big tiger poaching going on in those areas. It's the wrong sort of forest, and it's the wrong sort of terrain for that. Whereas I think the slightly lower, more typical rainforest is much more susceptible to those kind of issues.
So you went over there and with the hope that you could sort this out. So now you're there, you can't get into Loiser National Park. And how do you come up with this plan B?
Well, this was basically thanks to Saeed. I think, as Iris said, Saeed, after university, he went into whitewater kayaking instruction. And through, I think, mutual friends, got into mountain climbing. And he set himself the aim of, because so much of Aceh is unexplored, of climbing this 100 mountains, making first ascents on 100 mountains in Sumatra. And so he set up an organization called Aceh Tracker with a group of his friends with that aim, Roy being one of the founding members. Obviously, we'd been put in contact with them and we were like, okay, so let's do a first ascent. Let's find somewhere. Where have you got any idea? Where do you think we should go? And so he throws out Mount Kuru, and he says, this has never been, no one's ever climbed this. It's an area I've been near before, but I haven't obviously been to this area. So as far as I'm aware, this is completely unexplored forest. We've had a look. We don't think there's been any expeditions to that mountain, to the area surrounding that mountain. I think actually there has been, just after us, like this month, there's been a repeat expedition by a mountaineering group from northern Sumatra. But before us, we think we were the first people, certainly the first people conducting scientific research in that area. Plus, we got the additional aim now of making a first ascent, which is always exciting. So we were very keen. So I was asking Saeed, have we got a mountain? And he had this as a backup plan straight off. And the police gave us permission on that one, which was brilliant.
And also, they actually went and did the third ascent of the mountain we actually ended up climbing in 2014. So they actually knew the area, and they kind of knew, whilst we did have to cut through and with machetes, there were kind of trails, and they kind of knew where we were going, where we could find water, which helped a lot to actually get to places.
Basically, Mount Kuru and Mount Lombu are adjacent to each other. They're separated by about 12, 15 kilometers of forest. So Roy and Saeed had made the first ascent since 1930 with the Dutch colonists. They'd made the second ascent of Mount Kuru. So up till that point, we were trying to follow their previous camps as we made our way towards that mountain. And indeed, we did obviously end up climbing Mount Lombu when we couldn't ascend Mount Kuru.
Why weren't you able to make the first summit attempt on Mount Kuru?
We found a base camp in a valley with a river. So on that day, Oli and I actually stayed back so that Ryan Seed could have a first look and see, because it's always different. You have a topography of a map and kind of see what's out there, but you actually have to go there. So they said, okay, this day we're just going to have a first look and cut some trails so it's quicker for the next day to get early and get there. But it turned out that path, well, not existing path, that sort of way up we thought we could go, turned to be a lot worse. So the forest was a lot denser. It was almost impossible, like crawling through. Could barely get any kilometres, any meters done. So at that point, they thought, okay, this is pretty impossible, so we'll have to find a different route. But then going back, actually, Said had a pretty bad accident. So he tried to put his machete down and stay into the ground, because the ground's normally really soft. But there turned out to be a rock underneath. So basically slipped off, and his finger got cut down to the bone. So that started bleeding a lot and was kind of hindering us to go further as well. So he stayed back at base camp the next few days, painkillers and so on. So another reason why we couldn't go.
But the maps of this area are wildly inaccurate. Well, we were hoping there'd be a fairly obvious ridgeline to follow to the summit over about 4 to 6 kilometers. When we got there and started trying to cut trail through incredibly dense moss forest, it's just cruel stand. It wasn't just that, it was vertical. It was 20 meters of steep scrambling followed by 7 meters of vertical open rock face, which we were completely unprepared for. And you don't know what it's going to be like till you're there, and suddenly it turned out this was vertical climbing for sections of it. And over a full day of trying to cut a trail up the side of this mountain, which was need to be a 4 kilometer trail for the summit, Ryan Saeed managed to cut 900 meters. And at that point, we didn't have the supplies for that. We think we could do it if we had maybe 3 weeks there, but we had 5 days at base camp, so it wasn't happening. So we returned, and obviously, after Roy was injured, he was stuck at base camp, and we decided to make just the quickest summit possible of Mount Lombu. We were up at dawn, summited around maybe 2 in the afternoon, and back by night, and just to get that done. But we really needed to sort of turn around at that point in case the bone became infected, because it was quite an open. It was all the way through, really. That was quite a bad cut on that one. I think he was in a lot of pain. And with a week to walk out of the forest with that finger hanging off wasn't particularly brilliant, I don't think.
After your time in the forest with the biology part of your field work, you set out to walk across rural Sumatra to the coast. What was that experience like, and how was the interaction with the locals?
So it was actually kind of part of the biology of it as well, seeing that we wanted to compare the pristine forested area where we just left to actually the palm plantations and farmland and urban areas. So compare the biodiversity being obvious. Obviously, there's a lot more biodiversity in the forest, that's why we should protect it. So we did keep on recording all birds and actually mammals as well we saw on the way, but obviously it was less of them, so it had less of them.
But the local people, genuinely, Sumatra turned out to be the most welcoming country I've ever been to. We obviously were pretty prepared. We had tarpaulins, we had hammocks, we had sleeping bags, we were prepared to carry our food, we had camping stoves, we had everything sort of set up from the forest that we were planning on sleeping rough as we walked to the coast over this just over 3 weeks, I think, of walking. And every single village we got to, we were invited back to a house, we were offered food, we were offered a place to stay for the night. The most incredibly hospitable people in these really remote rural villages. None of the children had ever seen a Westerner. They were just so excited and so welcoming. And we actually had, over 3 weeks, we did not spend a single night sleeping rough. So, we ended up carrying all this camping equipment for absolutely no reason, because people were just so welcoming everywhere we went. And it was, we called it 100% hospitality, because over this, over this 20-something days we were walking, about 3 weeks, every single night we were given a place to stay. And sometimes in the day, we were being given too much food, because every village you get to, maybe once every 10 kilometers perhaps, every other house is trying to drag you in to have lunch with their mother and offering you rice to take with you, and just absolutely brilliant in terms of how welcoming people were. I don't think at any point we felt genuinely threatened at any point of this walk. Previously in India, it was very welcoming, and I met a lot of nice people, but this was just another level of how welcoming people were. It was genuinely incredible.
So now that you've collected all of this data, what do you do with it? Are you going to write it up in a report yourself, or do you hand it off to other researchers? What happens?
So I'm actually currently in the process of analysing the data. So I've got 2 notebooks, and I'm going to write everything down in an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm actually going to write a report on it, which was part of the contract of getting the funding from my home university, Edinburgh. So I'm going to write a report, do some, as far as possible with that data, do some statistical analysis. And then actually we're going to try and send it to other researchers there as well. So try and send it to as many local people as possible, so we can actually use the data to maybe convince the government this is a really incredible place, we should really conserve it, or get other people to go there and collect more data. So we're definitely going to try and probably put it online as well, and just make it as accessible as possible, really.
What turned out to be the most challenging part of the expedition?
Weirdly, it was quite early on in the forest. Obviously, the forest section was much, much harder because we were carrying 20-something kilogram packs. We're carrying all our own food. And it sounds stupid, but in the rainforest, water is actually very hard to come by because the rain comes down and then just evaporates into mist. So we're sort of finding one water source a day. And on the third day in the forest, we left a small stream behind in the early morning, and we got quite lost coming up this ridgeline. It's very difficult to try and see these topographical features of the landscape because of the forest. And we were coming up this ridge, and we ended up on the side of this ridge rather than on the crest of the ridge. And we ended up walking well into the night to try and get to where we thought the next water source would hopefully be. And we ran out of water around 6 in the evening. And just for morale's sake, we were drinking out. If you unscrew the bottle cap from a classic little plastic water bottle, we were filling those up and having one of those each just to ration the last of the water because we were that low at around 6. And then obviously we were walking for another 6-7 hours with effectively no water at that point. We had one can of, I think it was, we had one can of milk with us that we shared out. That was one of those sections where we knew we'd get to the water source. The worst case scenario really was camping and then walking back the way we'd come the next day on no water. And obviously you're going to make it, you have to make it. But that was a proper exhaustion point where you're just, you're just in sort of zombie mode walking and when you're that tired and that dehydrated and you're just not concentrating on where you walk and you're on a very knife edge ridge in thick forest and suddenly you're just walking into rattan, just these thick thorns going into your hair and you reach out a hand and smack your head into a tree every 5 minutes because you're just so out of it and it just gets to you and gets to you and gets to you. That was the most physically challenging day for me.
And I think it was also hard having to do that, just really hard walking every day, which is a big challenge in itself. But at the same time, being actually aware of what's around you, because you're recording data, you have the scientific purpose as well, so you can't just zone out in a way. You still have to record the data, which was quite a huge challenge. It was quite different from just working in a lab. And
you've got to be looking around, and you can't just head forward, focus on the pack in front of you, just get walking. You've got to be looking up in the trees. You've got to be prepared to stop, pack off, GPS out, notebooks out, start noting. And that sounds like it should be a rest, but it's quite often really not, when you're trying to concentrate on just covering distance and suddenly you've got to do stop, look. Was that something? No, it's not. Keep going. And it's just a mental fatigue on top of the physical fatigue. But obviously that was the point of why we're there, and it was a lot of fun to do, and I'm very happy we did do it.
What was your favorite part of the expedition?
I think for me it was seeing actually mammals, actually monkeys, Thomas Lead monkeys for the first time. So it was just me being back at camp in the tent, and we just heard this noise. We could hear animals, the animals moving. So kind of an imagination, actually, could it be a tiger going to water source or anything like that? But yeah, it turned out to be monkeys just being right there. And they didn't see us at the beginning, which was incredible. But then we were to try to see what's out there, and spotted us and made this amazing noise. And that was incredible, really incredible. And I was hearing gibbons at night from a distance. It's just a really beautiful sound. So I think it was great actually getting to the summit of Lumbu. It was a really amazing views. But in a way, actually going there, seeing the wildlife and knowing that they're completely wild, we might be the first humans I've ever seen that. I think that was actually, in a way, more exciting for me.
Yeah, on a similar note, I think for me, if we're talking about the forest section here, that the most incredible thing was just being in an area of completely unexplored forest, and it just feels very Lost World, Arthur Conan Doyle, and you're just sort of, every time you walk away from the camp, just by yourself for a bit, you are the first person to have ever gone into that area. You just go for a little stroll up a dry stream bed and find a cave or find, turn over a rock, and you could find a new species, you could find anything, really. No one's ever looked in that area, no one's ever been in that area. Anything you find, you're the first person to see it, you're the first person to find it, and it's just this constant low level of just sort of surreal adrenaline going on that you are completely the first person in this area. And certainly as someone who's obviously grown up wanting to do these kind of adventures, but that was really the first time I've been in some of them as an absolute first.
Were you guys recording insects as well?
No.
No, actually, we weren't recording insects. We would have not walked very far otherwise. Insects, just, you wouldn't really do a transect with them. You would just focus on like a quadrant and then just map it on a tree and then actually guess it up cool enough. And for species, you could be working like just on one tree for like years, really, of the incredible biodiversity being found in that place. So you couldn't really incorporate it in a mega transect. Like, you wouldn't have walked at all.
Is there anything that you would do differently if there were to be a next time?
Well, I hope there will be a next time. I mean, I was talking to Saeed literally this morning about perhaps going back, and I think I'd want to go in that area again, or at least a very similar area. But I think I'd want to try and get a bit more funding together and just do it for longer. I mean, we're in the forest for 16 days, and then after that, we're walking for almost a month, so 3 and a bit weeks. So the majority of the trek was outside the forest. And I'd love to get into remote forest, either on Sumatra or one of the other Indonesian islands, for a serious amount of time, well upwards of a month, perhaps, maybe not 2 months, but a month and a half at least. And obviously a lot more planning's got to go into that, but just so you can really get just as far away as sort of possible from any sort of thought of poaching or deforestation, get well up into these mountains and really have a go at something really challenging. For Mount Kuri, I reckon, if we had a couple of weeks at base camp, we'd have made it. We had 5 days, we didn't. So just have that flexibility with time and supplies, leave supply dumps as you go. So I'd love to go back, but I just want the time commitment on it, I think, would be the biggest difference.
Oli, the last time we spoke, you had some trouble with your feet on your previous expedition in India, and I saw that photograph on your Facebook page where you're trying to squeeze into those little shoes. So how were things for your feet on this one?
Oh, no, don't worry. I learned my lesson in India where I had about 50% of the skin gone. So I was ultra careful. If there was even a bit of rubbing, it was like I took about 8 pairs of socks this time, and it was just like fresh socks on, tape it up. Actually, before I went, I was doing a lot of barefoot walking and a bit of barefoot running to try and toughen that up. But I think the most important thing, just whenever you even get the slightest hint of rubbing, before it's even sore, just get tape on that. And I was absolutely fine, didn't have really a single blister on the whole trek. So I've learned my lesson from India, I think on that one. And obviously my boots, which are the same ones I wore across India, are really quite worn in now because they've had well over 1,000 kilometers of wear at this point, maybe 2,000. So they're pretty comfy now. They've been broken in.
Guys, what's next for you?
I guess we don't quite know yet at this stage, but I definitely want to go back to somewhere next summer because it would actually be a great opportunity to write my dissertation in something in the field. It would be nice to go to Congo actually and work with chimpanzees, but I guess that requires more emailing researchers out there and seeing if that's feasible at all.
I think for me, after I got back from India, I actually gave a talk in London with a couple of other guys, and one of them, Matthew, so he contacted me only this week, and he was saying, do you want to go to, got a bit of spare money, maybe we could head over to this quite remote area in northeast Afghanistan for a bit of a trek, maybe for a month next year. So I'm thinking that's the next thing I've definitely got my eye on now is getting up there and doing something, again, remote, but much more focused on people and culture rather than forest. And then, I'd love to get back in the forest, but maybe that'll be a bit later on next year. So I'll see what money allows and what time allows. But I think for me, next one might be Afghanistan.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more?
Okay, I've got Instagram at Oli Broadhead. My email is olibhead@gmail.com. And I do have a Facebook page, which I very rarely use, but Oli Broadhead Photography on Facebook.
Well, I guess we both have a website, so I think it's an email address, so I guess it's just the easiest way. Berger.org.
And mine is olibroadhead.com, so very easy to remember.
Oli Broadhead, Iris Berger, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I'll give a special thank you to Iris for getting up so early at 4 a.m. California time. Appreciate it, guys. As far as I know, on this podcast, no one's ever gotten up that early to do a podcast. So thank you, Iris.
Thank you very much, man. Thanks.
Recorded September 9th, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.